The Knights Templar, are they the guardians of the Holy Grail? I'm Timothy Hogan, Grand Master of the Knights Templar.
And I'm Scott Wolter, forensic geologist and a Knights Templar. And this is The Mysteries of the Knights Templar. Who knew the legends of the Holy Grail originated with the Knights Templar? And that begs the question, what is the Holy Grail? Tim, what is it?
You know, traditionally, it's always been sold to the public as the cup that Jesus either used at the Last Supper, or in some traditions, it was the cup that collected the blood that came out of the wounds of Jesus as he was on the cross. Either way, the cup, it was the cup of Jesus.
Physical cup.
A physical cup, according to some traditions. In fact, that's the popular perception of it. But in fact, there was a lot more to this concept.
Yes, indeed. So let's just say for a second, for argument's sake, that the Grail is the cup that was used at the Last Supper or to collect the blood of Christ. But then where did it go? It seems to have disappeared to history, or do the Templars have it?
Well, and this is the deal. People from this point forward then hear about the Grail quest, or the quest for the Holy Grail to find it. These ideas were popularized in the Grail romances that were associated with the legend of King Arthur and the Round Table.
Yep. And
the story is also really emphasized in some of the early medieval romances, like the story Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach from the 1200s. And specifically in Parsifal, it says that the Grail was guarded by the Knights Templar. He said the Grail story was told to him by a certain Kiat of Provence. And we actually know who this Kiat is. His real name was Giat of Provence. He was someone who probably knew Wolfram von Eschenbach in the German courts. And they discussed these Grail stories, and the evidence suggests that they were both Templars themselves. So they were trying to pass on this Grail tradition. There were other Grail stories, though. There was a person by the name of Chrétien de Troyes who created one of the other first Grail stories. Chrétien de Troyes also talked about the Grail, the quest for the Grail. It should be pointed out that Chrétien lived this town of Troyes. This is where the Templars had their rule created.
Yep, by Saint Bernard de Clairvaux.
By Saint Bernard de Clairvaux.
In 1129, on January 13th, a papal bull was signed making the Knights Templar an official order. Now, obviously they existed before that, but I digress.
Right. Well, and Chrétien just happened to be the cousin of Catherine de St. Clair. And Catherine de St. Clair was the wife of Hugh de Paynes, the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. So whether you look to Wolfram von Eschenbach or Chrétien de Troyes, either way, these stories go back to the Templars.
Right. So let's just talk for a second. The Holy Grail being the cup of Christ is certainly a plausible possibility. What else could it be?
So one of the other names for the Holy Grail, according to these early romances, particularly Sir Thomas Malory's from his Le Mort d'Arthur series, refers to the Holy Grail as the Sang Grail. And if we divide this name up, it suggests holy blood.
Right.
Which some have suggested could represent this holy bloodline between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. But the one thing we know is this bloodline has a history of passing on a tradition.
Yes.
And this is the tradition of the spiritual ideas, which seem to go back to Atlantis. In fact, there's even a suggestion within French traditions that the bloodline married into the Merovingian king line.
And Merovingian, of course, means the vine of Mary, right?
The vine of Mary,
And I don't think they're talking about the Virgin Mary here.
Correct.
It's Mary Magdalene.
Correct. And it also, they have myths talking about how this goes back to some sort of a sea monster that came out of the sea. Some have interpreted this as going back to the tradition of the Atlanteans arriving on the shores of France and bringing their tradition and having their own traditions surviving there. Then the bloodline of Mary and Jesus, which would have also recognized it, wed into later on.
Let's talk about something that is, again, getting back to some factual information that most people are not aware of that supports this whole bloodline, possibly being the Holy Grail. Now, at the time of Jesus and Mary and John the Baptist, it was part of the tradition. In fact, it was a requirement to be a Hebrew priest. You were required to be married.
Yeah.
And you were required to have a son for succession.
Right.
So this whole idea of Jesus being married and having children that is so heretical to some people was in fact the required tradition.
Tied into this, of course, the Holy Grail is full of other symbolism. I mean, we talked at an earlier episode about how the word grail probably comes from Graal, G-R-A.A-L, which was the science of transmutation or alchemy. From ancient Sumer, which had been inherited from the Atlanteans. We find the same idea in Egypt, where it is called Gradal, and it was said to be a science which produced the healing mana and the red waters of life, or sometimes known as the blood of Osiris, which would in fact be later known in alchemical texts as the red lion or the blood of Christ.
Right.
So here we have this tradition. In Parsifal, we certainly have the Grail also being mentioned as an emerald that was knocked out of the crown of Lucifer during the war in heaven and was brought to earth by neutral angels.
Could it be this?
Yeah, which seems to be suggesting the emerald tablet.
Right.
There was certainly a hermetic mystery there. In the Grail legends, it talks about how there's a fisher king who represents the age of the fish.
Pisces the fish.
Pisces, who's wounded. He's received a wound where he's torn between dualities. He can't sit, but he can't stand. He's not alive, but he's not dead. He's in this state of limbo. And it's only the Grail that's able to heal him from this state. Some have suggested that the Grail, in this instance, as he is sick, the land becomes sick as well. So there's a as within, so without relationship, or as above, so below relationship that we also find in the Emerald Tablet. But we also have the fact that if he represents the Age of Pisces, then who's the Grail maiden with the Grail? What does she represent? And it seems to suggest she can also represent the science and philosophies of the Grail, which are to come to expression during the new age of Aquarius.
So let's talk about that for a sec, because you hear people talk about ages, you talk about progressions, and I think we have to take a step back and help people understand that this is really about astronomy, and probably, in my opinion, serves as the basis for this whole concept of as above, so below. And what we're talking about is the Earth is surrounded by a zodiacal belt of the 12 primary constellations of the zodiac. And on the morning of the spring equinox, the zodiacal belt goes through the eastern sky. And at any point in time, you will have one of those constellations sitting on the horizon. And then when the sun rises through that constellation, this is sacred and considered part of that age, whatever constellation it is. If we look at the 12 constellations, because of the Earth's slight wobble, it causes that belt to rotate around the Earth. Now, obviously, it's not rotating, we are, and it gives the appearance of that. So that's why this thing moves. But it has been calculated that it takes 26,000 years for the zodiacal belt to make one complete rotation. Now that's an awfully long time, and if you divide it by 12, you get about 2168 years. Now, the time that one constellation spends in the eastern sky before it descends and then the next one cycles through is not exactly 2168 years. It depends on the size of the constellation.
And also then as we move forward into Aries, during the time of the end of Aries, this is where we have Abraham sacrificing the ram.
Yes.
Symbolically ending the age
of Aries, the ram.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what did we move into? Pisces.
When they talk about Jesus, they say that he was born of the Lamb of God. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is he was born in the last 4 years of Aries the ram, and then he is initiated by
John the Baptist,
who calls him, he now becomes the Fisher King, right?
Right.
And the Fisher of Men refers to Pisces, and of course the Christian fish that we see on the back of the cars.
and the disciples are fishermen.
Fishermen, exactly. Yeah. So this is a very profound thing, and when people think about it from that perspective, I think it changes a few things. What we are living through right now is one of the most profound moments in human history. Everybody here making this episode, everybody watching this episode is part of this. And what's happening here is we are not just living through the transition from the age of Pisces to Aquarius, which happens 12 times during this cycle, right? What's happening now is we are experiencing the end of that 26,000 year long cycle, one of the most profound moments in human history.